The stillness of the early morning is shattered by the shrill wail of police sirens. Flashing red and blue lights dance across the high school parking lot, drawing the attention of students, teachers, and passers-by. Conversations freeze mid-sentence, replaced by hushed murmurs and anxious glances. The air is heavy with tension as a crowd begins to form at the edge of the chaos, craning their necks for a better view of what's happening. Through the crowd, Lila Harper emerges, flanked by two police officers. Her hands are cuffed, trembling slightly, as she clutches a worn notebook. Bloodstains streak her clothes, and her face is pale, her expression a mix of defiance and shock. Her gaze shifts between the asphalt beneath her feet and the growing crowd. Whispers ripple through the onlookers, their eyes widening at the sight of her. A stretcher appears, wheeled by paramedics. The body on it is concealed beneath a white sheet, but the pool of blood trailing from beneath the fabric is unmistakable. The name spreads through the crowd like wildfire. Ethan Calloway. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief fill the air. Is he Ethan? No way. What happened? Lying just a few feet away from where Ethan's body was discovered is a notebook. Its cover splattered with blood. Written on the front in bold, uneven letters are the words Mr. Calloway. The pages, some crumpled and torn, peek out, revealing fragments of dark poetry and torn photographs of Ethan's face. The notebook seems to vibrate with the weight of its contents, a haunting clue to the mystery unfolding. Students huddle in small groups, their voices frantic but hushed. She was obsessed with him, one whispers. They were fighting yesterday, by the bleachers, another says, her voice shaking. I heard she couldn't let him go, a boy adds, eyes darting nervously to Lila. Teachers hover nearby, their attempts to maintain order falling flat. The tension in their expressions mirrors that of the students, each one struggling to comprehend what they've just witnessed. As the murmurs swell, the scene feels suspended in time. The horror on the faces of the crowd lingers, a blend of confusion, fear, and disbelief. What could drive someone to this point? Was it love, manipulation, or something far darker, lurking beneath the surface of what anyone could have imagined? Lila Harper sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the pale, peeling wallpaper of her small bedroom. Outside, the world seemed alive, but in her home, silence pressed down like a weight. The muffled sounds of her parents' TV drifted from the living room. Some religious sermon her mother insisted on watching every night. Her notebook lay open on her lap, the pages covered in jagged handwriting. Poetry was her escape, her rebellion against a life that felt like it was constantly closing in. Her mother's words still rang in her ears. Why do you waste your time on that nonsense? Writing won't put food on the table. Lila's fingers tightened around her pen. She didn't bother arguing anymore. It never made a difference. Her father, as usual, stayed silent. His passivity hurt almost as much as her mother's sharp remarks. At school, it wasn't much better. She wasn't invisible. No, that would have been easier. Instead, she was a target. Her thrift store clothes and soft-spoken nature made her stand out in all the wrong ways. The whispers behind her back, the occasional cruel comment about her weird poems or her church girl vibe, they had chipped away at her confidence until she felt like little more than a shell. But when she wrote, she felt alive. The words gave her a voice when she didn't have the courage to speak. Dinner was a quiet affair. The clink of forks against plates filled the silence as her mother frowned at her untouched vegetables. Don't slouch, Lila. "You'll ruin your posture," her mother snapped. "And stop hiding in your room all the time. You need to learn how to behave like a proper young lady if you ever want to make something of yourself." Lila didn't respond, staring down at her plate. Her father cleared his throat. "Let's just eat in peace," he said softly. But he didn't meet Lila's eyes. Later that night, Lila wrote furiously in her notebook. Her poetry wasn't just words, it was everything she couldn't say aloud. Ethan Calloway smiled as he walked into his classroom, carrying his usual air of easy confidence. The students liked him. He was young, approachable, and had a knack for making even the dullest topics interesting. But there was another side to Ethan, a part he kept hidden. At home, things weren't so charming. His marriage was hanging by a thread, strained by years of financial struggles and emotional distance. Arguments with his wife had become a nightly ritual. In the classroom, though, he felt in control. His students looked up to him, and he thrived on their admiration. Sometimes he tested boundaries, just a compliment that lingered too long, a smile that felt too personal. It wasn't crossing the line, not exactly, but it was close. Lila had never spoken much in class, but that day was different. They were discussing poetry, and Ethan had asked the students to share something they'd written. Lila hesitated, but the encouraging look on his face pushed her to raise her hand. Her voice shook as she read her poem, but when she finished, Ethan's expression softened. "That was raw and haunting, Lila," he said, his voice genuine. "You have a real talent." For the first time, Lila felt seen, truly seen. Her heart swelled with something she couldn't quite name. At home that evening, Lila's mind was elsewhere. She barely registered her mother's complaints or her father's passive nods. All she could think about was the way Ethan had looked at her, the way he'd praised her. "Stop daydreaming and clear the table," her mother barked. Lila obeyed silently, retreating to her room as soon as she could. She opened her notebook, her pen moving furiously across the pages. Her poems began to take on a new tone, passionate, intense, and centered on a single muse. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to encourage her writing. He'd linger after class to offer feedback on her work, his words carefully chosen to inspire her. "You have something special, Lila. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise," he said one afternoon, handing back her journal with a small smile. Lila clung to his words. They were a lifeline in a world that constantly tried to tear her down. Lila's admiration for Ethan grew with every interaction. She began to see him as more than just a teacher. He was the only person who truly understood her, who saw her for who she really was. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor, the way her eyes lingered on him, the nervous energy in her voice when she spoke to him. But he didn't discourage it. If anything, he reveled in the quiet power he held over her. Late one night, Lila sat on her bed, her notebook open before her. Her pen moved feverishly as she poured her feelings into a poem. "You are the light in my darkness, the forbidden flame I cannot touch. Your name whispers through my veins, a secret I'll never confess aloud." She paused, her heart racing, and whispered his name softly into the silence. Ethan, meanwhile, sat at his desk, flipping through her latest poems. A smirk played on his lips as he read her words, but he didn't understand just how deep her obsession ran, or how dangerous it would become. Lila sat at her desk in the quiet corner of the library, her notebook open, the edges of the pages frayed from restless hands. She stared at Ethan's latest feedback, written in his neat handwriting. This is brilliant, Lila. You're truly gifted. Her chest swelled with pride. No one had ever called her gifted before. His words were more than just encouragement. They were validation, something she'd craved for as long as she could remember. After class, Ethan caught her in the hallway. That last poem you wrote? I can't stop thinking about it, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His smile lingered a second too long, and Lila's cheeks flushed. You're special, Lila, he added, his tone soft but firm. Don't ever doubt that. The words were like fuel to a fire, burning away every doubt she'd ever had about herself. That evening, Lila's phone buzzed. She hesitated, then opened the message. I loved your latest poem. Keep this between us. Her heart pounded. The thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, making her feel closer to Ethan than ever. She reread the message over and over, each time convincing herself that it meant something more. In his apartment across town, Ethan set his phone down and sighed. It had been a harmless message, he told himself, just a way to keep her motivated. Lila's journal became her sanctuary, page after page filled with poems about longing and love, about a man who understood her in ways no one else could. She began to imagine a life where Ethan wasn't just her teacher, but her savior, the one who would take her away from her stifling home and show her the world. Her fantasies bled into reality. She started wearing her hair the way she thought Ethan might like. She'd linger after class, hoping for a moment alone with him. Every glance, every word he spoke to her felt like confirmation of what she believed was their unspoken connection. It started innocently enough, walking past his house on her way home just to see where he lived. But soon, Lila found herself standing outside his window at night, the light from his living room casting shadows on the curtains. She convinced herself it wasn't wrong. She wasn't hurting anyone. She just wanted to feel closer to him. Ethan, preoccupied with his own troubles, didn't notice the figure lingering in the shadows. In school, Lila's behavior didn't go unnoticed. A group of students whispered in the hallway, watching her as she waited outside Ethan's classroom long after the final bell. She's always hanging around him, one girl muttered. I saw them talking after class yesterday, another added. It's weird. The whispers spread quickly, reaching the ears of other students and even a few teachers. Ethan heard the rumors too. At first, he dismissed them as idle gossip. But as they grew louder, he realized he needed to create some distance. He stopped lingering after class, cutting their conversations short. When Lila handed him her latest poem, he read it quickly, muttered, "Nice work," and walked away. Lila felt the change immediately. The warmth in his gaze, the softness in his voice, it was all gone. Confused and hurt, she convinced herself that he was only pulling away because of societal pressures. Lila couldn't stand the distance. She turned to her best friend, Cassie, desperate for someone to understand. He's just scared, Lila said, her voice trembling. He loves me, but he's afraid of what people will think. Cassie's eyes widened. Are you saying you and Mr. Calloway are together? Lila hesitated, then nodded. He told me to keep it a secret, but I can't anymore. I love him, Cassie. Cassie's shock quickly turned to excitement, and by the next day, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Late one night, Ethan's wife, Rachel, scrolled through his phone while he slept. The message from Lila caught her attention. I wrote this for you. It's how I feel. Attached was a poem, raw and emotional, filled with lines about forbidden love and longing. Rachel's heart sank. Shaking him awake, she held the phone up. What is this, Ethan? Why is a student sending you this? Ethan rubbed his face, groggy and defensive. She's just a troubled kid. I've been trying to help her. Rachel's voice cracked. This doesn't look like helping Ethan. It looks like something else. At school, the rumors about Ethan and Lila reached a fever pitch. Teachers exchanged worried glances in the staff room, while students whispered in the hallways. Ethan tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the weight of the scrutiny was suffocating. His colleagues avoided him, and the principal called him in for a chat that felt more like an interrogation. Meanwhile, Lila's obsession deepened. She believed the chaos was proof that the love was real, that it was worth fighting for. Ethan sat alone in his classroom, staring at the stack of papers he was supposed to grade. His life was unraveling, and he had no idea how to stop it. Lila, on the other hand, felt emboldened. She scribbled furiously in her journal, planning her next move. She would make him see that they belonged together, no matter what it took. The stage was set. Neither of them realized how close they were to the breaking point. The park was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest. The only sound came from the wind rustling through the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic. Ethan sat on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp, his jaw clenched and his foot tapping nervously against the ground. He checked his watch again. Lila was late. Meanwhile, Lila stood at the park's entrance, clutching her bag tightly. She'd spent an hour choosing her outfit, settling on a dress she thought made her look older. Inside the bag, her hand brushed against the cold steel of the knife. It wasn't meant for anything bad, she told herself. Just a precaution, in case things went wrong. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her heart racing with a mix of hope and dread. "Layla," Ethan said the moment she appeared, his voice sharp. "We need to talk." She smiled nervously, but it faded when she saw the hard set of his jaw. She sat on the bench beside him, her hands trembling. "Why did you ask me to come here?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with hope. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. "Because this has to stop. All of it. The rumors, the messages. It's too much." Lila's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. You care about me. I know you do." Ethan turned to face her, his expression cold. "Lila, you're a child. You don't know what you're talking about." Her stomach dropped. "But the things you said, the way you looked at me, that was me trying to encourage you." Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "I was trying to be a good teacher, and you twisted it into something it's not. You're just a foolish kid playing games you don't understand." Each word felt like a slap. Lila's hands gripped the edge of the bench as tears welled in her. "I'm not a child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you, Ethan. I've always loved you. You're the only one who sees me, who understands me." "Stop it," Ethan said, standing up. "This isn't love, Lila. It's obsession, and it's dangerous." She dropped to her knees in front of him, clutching his hand. "Please," she begged, "leave your wife. We can be happy together. I'll do anything. Just say you love me." Ethan yanked his hand away, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get it, do you? There is no us. There never was." Lila stared at him, her chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You're lying," she said, her voice trembling. "You're only saying this because you're scared." "Enough!" Ethan shouted, taking a step back. "Go home, Lila, and don't contact me again." She reached for his arm, desperation overtaking her. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that." Ethan shoved her hand away. "Get away from me." The force of his rejection hit her like a physical blow. Her vision blurred with tears, her breathing erratic. Without thinking, her hand plunged into her bag, grasping the knife. Ethan froze as the blade glinted in the faint light. "Leela," he said cautiously, his hands raised. "Put that down." But Lila's mind was a storm of rage, pain, and confusion. "You don't get to leave me," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "You said I was special. You said I mattered." "Lila, listen to me," Ethan pleaded, taking a step back. "This isn't you. You don't have to do this." But it was too late. In a blind frenzy, she lunged forward, the knife striking again and again. Her sobs filled the night as Ethan collapsed to the ground, his hands clutching his wounds. His eyes met hers, wide with shock and pain. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lila dropped the knife, her hands trembling and coated in blood. I just wanted you to panic set in." Lila stumbled back, staring at Ethan's still form on the ground. The realization of what she'd done hit her like a tidal wave. She turned and ran, her breath hitching as she darted through the dark streets. Her hands shook uncontrollably, the sticky warmth of blood a constant reminder of her actions. The fluorescent lights of a gas station came into view, and Lila staggered toward it, her legs barely holding her up. The clerk looked up as she entered, his eyes widening at the sight of her bloodied hands and tear-streaked face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with alarm. Leela didn't answer. She collapsed near the entrance, her body racked with sobs. "I didn't mean to," she whispered to no one in particular. "I didn't mean to." The clerk grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights illuminating the gas station. Lila didn't resist as they handcuffed her face pale and devoid of emotion. As they guided her to the squad car, she glanced back toward the direction of the park. "I just wanted him to stay," she murmured, her voice barely audible. At the park, paramedics worked frantically, but it was too late. Ethan's lifeless body lay among the fallen leaves, a pool of blood staining the ground beneath him. Nearby, a blood-streaked notebook sat open, its pages filled with Leela's poems about forbidden love and longing. One of the officers picked it up, flipping through the haunting words. "What a mess," he muttered, shaking his head. As the flashing lights faded and the park grew silent again, the weight of the night's events settled over the town. In the stillness, the wind carried the faint scent of blood and fallen leaves, leaving behind a haunting reminder of a love turned deadly. The courthouse stood like a fortress in the center of the small town, surrounded by news vans and crowds of protesters holding signs. Reporters pushed microphones into the faces of anyone who might give them a new headline, their voices overlapping in a chaotic hum. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Lila sat at the defense table, her small frame swallowed by the stiff suit her mother had insisted she wear. Her hair was tied back, and dark circles underlined her wide eyes, making her look even younger than her 17 years. The public opinion was split. Outside the courthouse, two groups shouted at each other across the barriers. "She's just a kid. That man manipulated her," one woman yelled, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Lila." "She's a murderer. She knew exactly what she was doing." Another shouted back, her voice cracking with anger. The town, once quiet and united, was now a battlefield. In the courtroom, the prosecution painted a picture of Ethan as a dedicated teacher whose life was tragically cut short by Lila's dangerous obsession. They called him a victim of misplaced affection, focusing on the brutal nature of his death and the fear he must have felt in his final moments. The defense, however, dug into Ethan's past. They presented text messages, poems, and witness testimonies that hinted at an inappropriate closeness between him and Lila. Ethan Calloway blurred the boundaries between teacher and student, Lila's lawyer argued. He encouraged her infatuation and cultivated her trust, leaving her vulnerable and confused. The truth, as the jury soon realized, was murky and heartbreaking. There were no heroes in this. The Harpers sat in the front row, their faces pale and strained. Lila's mother, Karen, clutched a tissue in her hand, dabbing her eyes every few minutes. Her father, Tom, sat stiffly, his fists clenched on his lap. "This isn't our fault," Karen whispered, though her voice shook with doubt. Tom didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The whispers of the community haunted them. People blamed their strict rules, their lack of understanding, their inability to see the warning signs. "How could we not have known?" Karen finally said, her voice cracking. Across the room sat Rachel Calloway, Ethan's widow. Her face was a mask of cold determination. Rachel had filed a civil lawsuit against the Harpers, accusing them of failing to control their daughter and allowing her obsession to spiral out of control. But her fight was about more than money. It was about justice. "Teachers deserve protection from situations like this," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "No one should have to fear for their lives because a student misinterprets kindness." Her words added fuel to the fire, further dividing the community. The cell was small and cold, the metal bed creaking under Lila's weight as she sat with her knees drawn to her chest. In her hands, she held one of her journals, its edges worn and smudged. Flipping through the pages, she read the poems she'd written about Ethan, each line dripping with longing and desperation. Her stomach churned as she realized how naive and distorted her thoughts had been. Was it me? She whispered to herself. Or was it him? She couldn't tell anymore. The lines between guilt and manipulation blurred in her mind, leaving her lost in a fog of regret. The small town struggled to heal. The tragedy had left a permanent mark, its whispers lingering in classrooms, coffee shops and church pews. Schools implemented stricter policies, teachers growing wary of forming close bonds with students. Parents watched their children more closely, questioning every late night and emotional outburst. What had once been a tightly knit community was now fractured. The lines between blame and sympathy drawn sharply across the town. The verdict came after weeks of emotional testimony. Due to the defendant's age and the acknowledgement of Ethan Calloway's inappropriate behavior, the court sentences Lila Harper to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. The judge declared. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Lila didn't react. She stared straight ahead, her face pale and emotionless. As the courtroom emptied, her parents approached her. Karen reached out, touching Lila's hand briefly. "I'm sorry," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Back in her cell, Lila sat on the bed, staring at the notebook the court had returned to her. Its pages were stained with blood, the words she'd once written now a haunting reminder of the life she'd destroyed, including her own. The cell was silent except for the faint hum of distant voices. Lila traced the edge of the notebook with her finger, her mind replaying every moment that had led her here. "This is what love does," she murmured to herself. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them anymore. Outside, The world moved on, but the scars of her choices would remain on her, on Ethan's family, and on the town that would never forget. The quiet hum of the world outside Lila's cell was a stark contrast to the chaos within her mind. Alone with her thoughts, she replayed moments from her childhood, each memory a thread in the tapestry of her choices. Growing up in the Harper household had been a lesson in discipline, not love. Every success was met with expectations for more, every failure with stern lectures and silence. Leela had learned early that her worth was tied to achievement, but she longed for something deeper, someone who saw her for who she was, not what she could do. That longing festered over the years, growing into a desperate need for validation. When Ethan Calloway smiled at her poems and listened to her dreams, it felt like water to a withered flower. She had mistaken his attention for love, clinging to it as if it could fill the emotional void her upbringing had left behind. But vulnerability is a fragile thing, and in the wrong hands, it can be a weapon. Ethan Calloway had once been a man of promise, a teacher praised for his ability to inspire and connect with his students. But beneath the surface, he was a man blinded by his own desires, unable or unwilling to see the harm his actions caused. He should have been a guide, a protector. Instead, he allowed his ego to feed on Lila's admiration, blurring the boundaries of their relationship. The text messages, the subtle encouragements, the private moments. They were all choices he made, each one chipping away at the trust his position demanded. Perhaps he thought it was harmless, that a few kind words or stolen glances wouldn't matter. But those choices spiraled into something neither of them could control. His selfishness and failure to set boundaries became the seeds of a tragedy that would destroy them both. The tragedy didn't unfold in isolation. It grew in the shadows of a community too blind or too afraid to see the warning signs. Lila's peers whispered about her crush on Mr. Calloway, yet no one intervened. Teachers noticed her spending extra time in his classroom, but their discomfort stayed unspoken. Even her parents, strict as they were, failed to see the cracks in her facade. The silence was deafening. In a world where appearances mattered more than truths, the danger went unchecked until it was too late. How often do we ignore what makes us uncomfortable, assuming someone else will step in? The cost of that silence was etched in blood, a chilling reminder of what happens when we turn away from the warning signs. The narrator's voice softens, heavy with reflection. When boundaries are crossed, the cost is often paid in blood. Innocence is seldom what it seems. Leela was a girl searching for love in all the wrong places. Ethan was a man who should have known better. And the world around them watched in silence, letting the lines blur until the consequences became irreversible. The camera pans out from Lila's cell, the notebook still in her hands. Her eyes glisten with unshed tears as she stares into the distance, haunted by the weight of her choices. In the end, no one emerged unscathed, each life touched by the tragedy left to carry its scars.